It's been 10 years now since the UK shocked Europe by voting to leave the EU. Today, Britons remain deeply divided over what that decision has meant. Supporters say Brexit fulfilled the will of the majority of British voters. Others say it robbed a generation of opportunities and are campaigning to build stronger ties with Europe again.
10 years after the Brexit referendum, Europe's anthem, Beethoven's Ode to Joy, still echoes for pro-European Britons. They want the UK back in the room, or at least closer to it. Madalena Kay is part of the Young European movement, delivering a petition to Prime Minister Keir Starmer. They are pushing for a youth experience scheme to make it easier for young people to live, study and work in the EU. For Madalena, an artist, Brexit robbed her of those opportunities.
I have yet to experience or see any tangible benefits to myself, to the country, to British society, and also to global diplomacy. There are no benefits, there are only costs. So was it worth it? No, obviously not.
Neil Connolly is convinced that Brexit was the right choice. He and his mum, then a Conservative Party activist, had campaigned hard for it. But today, the train driver is not happy with the direction the country is heading in.
People have been ignored for so long. At this minute, taxation is a grind. It's basically killing the country. The GDP is dropping as a result.
10 years ago, he had a different vision.
Let June the 23rd go down in our history as our Independence Day.
Brexit campaigners like populist politician Nigel Farage promised that leaving the European Union would save hundreds of millions that could be invested in public services. But official figures now show that Brexit has actually hurt the UK economy. UK goods exports to the EU have taken a hit, dropping by 14% over 6 years. Even goods exports to non-EU countries dropped by 8%, as Britain is no longer a gateway to the EU.
It had a huge impact on investment. A lot of companies effectively stopped investing in Britain or started investing less. It had a huge impact on just general business sentiment, and there was a lot of uncertainty. And businesses don't like uncertainty. They like stable rules, they like predictability, and Brexit was the very opposite of that.
But Brexit supporter Neil Connolly sees it differently. For him, leaving the EU is not the cause of Britain's economic problems. He blames high taxes and too much migration. In his hometown of Romford, east of central London, an overwhelming majority had voted for Brexit. Yet Neil says migration has increased, which he says is putting pressure on housing and public services.
Reactive, it just seems to be hell-bent on putting as many people into the area as possible without plans for, cohesion or anything like that. All of the flats that are coming in are just monstrosities of tower and glass, more and more people, no faults to the facilities that are required, like the hospital.
After Britain left the EU, migration from European countries declined, but migration from non-European countries rose sharply, reaching almost 1 million in 2023 before falling again. Madalena Kay knows the real-life barriers of Brexit. She would like to move to Germany to live with her husband, but Brexit has made that far more complicated.
For me personally, Brexit is having a huge impact on my life. Because my husband is German and we cannot live together. We have to go through visa applications. It's inhumane and it's completely disrespecting just like basic human rights for people to have a family.
Together with other pro-Europeans, Madalena is campaigning for Britain to move closer to the EU again. And opinion polls show that many Britons agree Brexit is not popular anymore. In 2016, 52% of Britons voted to leave the EU. Now, polls suggest that the same share, 52%, would vote to rejoin. But for the moment, none of the big British parties is willing to run another referendum. EU membership would come at a high price.
I think what very few British politicians are willing to accept is that if you want to have a closer relationship with the EU, that means also accepting some of the difficult obligations that come with it around free movement of people and around paying into the EU budget.
In the meantime, artist Madeleine Kay is using all her creative energy to convince her fellow Britons to buy into her dream for Britain to rejoin the EU.
This is a long campaign, but those of us that believe in it passionately are here to make sure that we get there in the end.
10 years on, Britain seems to be as divided over Brexit as it was on the day of the vote, and neither side shows any sign of backing down.
DW correspondents are covering this story on both sides of the English Channel. Birgit Maas joins us now from Hull in the UK, and Rosie Bershot is in Brussels. Birgit, Britons have had plenty of time now to experience the effects of Brexit. What's been gained? What's been lost?
Well, Terry, where I am in Hull, people voted overwhelmingly for Brexit, but there are no celebrations here. And I think really it's a story of promises not kept. So we were filming at a food bank, we were filming with people who are really struggling with the cost of living. And they said that some of them said, well, Brexit was a good idea in principle, but then it wasn't really done very well, it wasn't executed well. But others also said it was a lie. So there's a sense of betrayal. And I think for a lot of people, it's a sense that their living standards really haven't risen. Some people told me about families where the parents don't eat because they want to save the food for their children, and that is a story that's not only happening here in Hull. These are stories that are replicated across the UK, and we know that Brexit has hit the UK economy by as much as 6%, is what a new study said. So definitely it's not, but for a lot of people, I don't think it's seen as a success.
Rosie, Brexit does not seem to have paid off for the UK the way its supporters at least were hoping. How has the divorce impacted the EU?
Well, first of all, Brexiteers said at the time that the UK's departure would break the EU. That has not happened. The bloc is alive, and in fact, more countries than before are queuing up to join this club. That doesn't mean that the EU sees this as anything of a success. In fact, over here in Brussels, it was never taboo for the EU to say that it regretted Brexit. It is harder now for EU businesses to trade with businesses in one of their closest neighbours in the UK. So this is really something which is seen as something which has harmed the EU, and it's smaller than it was before. Though it's important to note, EU countries, those that have remained, are not doing economically well either in most cases. It's not just the Brexit effect that is hurting the UK economy. We see economic contraction or difficulties in many EU countries. It was so bitter for a few years, this bickering back and forth of the divorce process. What has been really interesting is to see how over the past couple of years, we've seen a kind of total rethink, and I would really attribute that to especially Russian President Vladimir Putin. When he launched his full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the UK and the EU really had this wake-up call of realising that they had so much more in common than they had in terms of differences.
Birgit, one of the main figures banging the drum for Brexit 10 years ago was Nigel Farage. Today, his Reform UK party is leading the opinion polls in Britain. Is that not an indication that Brexit remains popular with British voters?
No, if you look at the opinion polls, Terry, it's really clear that a majority of people would now even support rejoin, or a much bigger majority now says that Brexit was a mistake. So that is clear. However, Brexit is not really pinned on Nigel Farage, even though, as you said, he was one of the driving forces of Brexit. Now, he is a populist right-wing politician, and he says, as he did then when he campaigned for Brexit, that migration is one of the key problems that the UK has. And migration, as we have seen also in the report, has risen in the past. So he comes in a way with the same solutions in order to, he says Britain needs to reduce migration even further and listen to the will of the people, as he would frame it. And this is a rhetoric that does resonate with some people who still think that something is not right for them. So it's sort of a protest vote of people who still feel forgotten and who still think that politics doesn't really work for them.
Rosie, 10 years ago, there was serious discussion about other countries possibly following Britain's example and leaving the EU. Is there still talk of that today?
No. Brexit has totally rewritten the rules of Europe's populist right. Remember, we used to hear talk of Frexit, the idea of France leaving the EU, Italexit, Italy, Nexit even, the idea of the Netherlands leaving the EU. But the leaders that were calling for that at the time, mostly on the far right of Europe's political spectrum, have gone pretty quiet on that front. There's been a real U-turn. In fact, the whole idea of Euroscepticism, that used to be really interpreted as parties which didn't like the EU, which didn't want to be part of the EU. Now that's really seen as just parties which say, well, we would rather have more power in the capitals, the different EU member states, than in Brussels. So that is a real shift. What should be noted, however, is that those populist right-wing parties have not seen their support go down since the Brexit referendum. Much like in the UK, many of them are still polling pretty high. Perhaps that change in their rhetoric, given that Brexit made leaving the EU so unfashionable, has contributed to that.
Rosie, Birgit, thank you both very much. That was Rosie Berschot in Brussels and Birgit Maas in Hull.
If the polls are to be believed, up to 2/3 of British voters across all party lines believe Britain's decision to leave the European Union 10 years ago was a mistake. A recent survey showed a majority thought Brexit had increased the cost of living and had a negative impact on the economy. Most young voters share that assessment. Asked whether there should be another referendum, almost 62% of Gen Z respondents said yes, with only around 11% agreeing. More than 26% said they don't know. So if a referendum were held, just under 60% of young voters said they would vote to rejoin, with only 9% saying they would vote to stay out. Well, that's what the stats tell us, but let's consider the politics of it all. Roger Casale is a former Member of Parliament for Britain's governing Labour Party. He's now founder and CEO of the New Europeans. That's a pro-EU organisation. Welcome to the day. So polls are one thing, political reality quite another. Can you see any circumstance under which a British government would reopen that toxic, explosive can of worms?
Well, you've answered your question in your question. I think it would be a toxic can of worms, and I don't think it would be a priority for any government coming soon. That may change at some point in the future, and let's hope it does change. As you've just shown, that young people in particular, this has been a lost 10 years for young people, and now that Britain is back in Erasmus and there's a discussion of a youth mobility scheme, maybe we can win something back for young people. But I think young people would be desperate for Britain to rejoin the European Union, but they don't run the country.
Now we've had 10 years to sort of get used to this idea and reflect on the decisions that got us here. Why do you think the British people chose this massive upheaval?
Well, it's a very good question. And I think 10 years after the event, 10 years today was the referendum, we still don't have a clear answer to that. I think it was, perhaps one can say in the simplest terms, it was much about emotion as it was about reason. And it was as much about identity and sovereignty as it was about economics and interests. And I think the mistake that was made by the Remain campaign, and I, as you would expect, I was a very strong Remain campaigner and I fought to keep Britain in the European Union after we left. But I think the mistake that we made was not to talk about the European Union as a community of values and not just a community of interests, and to emphasize that the European Union is important for our democracy and for our freedom, and that the idea of solidarity is very strong in the European Union. And all of these are British values. British people are just as European today as they were 10 years ago. But indeed, why did they cut off their nose to spite their face? As you'll remember, it was a very, very close result. And I think that in the end, all kinds of issues were at play, not just Britain's relationship with the European Union. The government was unpopular, and all sorts of factors helped to push the vote in the wrong direction. But I think the biggest thing that I would focus on reflecting on this over the last 10 years is that not enough was done in the 5, 10, 15, 20, 40 years before the referendum to really talk about the European Union, not just as a union of states and of markets, but a union of people. And I may not have my EU passport anymore, but I'm still a European, and so are many British people.
So As we said, it's still a live and toxic issue in the UK. So if we look at this from the other side of the English Channel, given that this is still such a live and toxic debate in the UK, can you see a circumstance under which Brussels would even contemplate the return to the club of such a troublemaking member?
Well, it would be an enormous PR game for the European Union if Britain were to say we want to come back. But let's remember, Britain had a very good deal before. It wasn't part of Schengen. It wasn't part of the monetary union. If Britain did want to rejoin the European Union, it would have to sign up to all kinds of things from which it had opt-outs before. I don't think there's any appetite in Brussels to make any special concessions for the UK. And I think given the way that Britain behaved, particularly under the Johnson government, that's very understandable.
So, as you say, you're an ardent Remainer. You really want the UK to return to the European fold. Have you seen any benefits to the country of the decision to leave?
I haven't seen any benefits. There are people who claim that there are certain benefits that come from having a little bit more freedom over regulation in certain sectors of the economy. There will be people who make that claim, but you have to balance that against the lack of mobility. You have to balance that against the disruption to supply chains and the disruption to trade and the economic overall, the macroeconomic result has been negative, not just a one-off negative, but a negative every year. British GMP is lower every year than it would have been if we were still in the European Union. So within that, in any kind of big change like that, you're always going to have winners and losers. I've yet to meet a winner from Brexit. Perhaps they exist. I don't say that they don't. But overall, it's been very negative.
Who would you say were the biggest losers from that decision?
Young people. Young people had their right to free movement, their right to work and study and live in another European Union country taken away, their rights diminished, their opportunities diminished, and it's been a lost generation, a lost 10 decade for young people. Fortunately, the Labour government has been able to negotiate Britain returning to Erasmus, and we and Europeans and other organisations are working to extend that to a youth mobility scheme for all young people, not just those who want to study, but those who want to volunteer, those who want to work, those who want to build a future for themselves across the European Union, to give them more opportunity and more mobility. But young people have certainly been the biggest losers, and I think that's reflected in the poll that you showed earlier on, which showed an overwhelming majority amongst young people to return to the European Union as soon as possible.
And so do you think, then, the best, you as an ardent supporter of the European Union, the best that you can reasonably hope for in the immediate future is the return of this youth mobility scheme? There's not going to be a rejoining of the bloc. The best that you can hope for is that young people get a bit more chance to travel.
I think that what we have to focus on is how we can make life simpler for citizens and how we can make life open up opportunities for individuals and the families and business, and especially young people. And yes, the youth mobility scheme would be the next step. I think we have to go step by step in bringing Britain closer to Europe again. That's also happening in the sector of defence, by the way, and security. The challenges we face in the world today require closer cooperation. But cooperation must be reinforced not just between governments, but above all between citizens and between people, and especially young people. So I think what we want to see is step by step, changes being made that make life simpler for people, make it easier to travel between Britain and the European Union without these long waits at the border, make it easier for young people to study, make it easier for young people in particular to work. So yes, I'm very much in favour of that approach, a step-by-step approach that is a practical approach, bringing Britain and Europe closer together from the perspective, from the point of view of citizens, especially young citizens. And if that in the end leads one day to people saying, well, yes, we should have the referendum, I'd be in favour of that. But I don't think this is a moment to campaign for it. We need to go step by step to bring Britain closer to Europe again.
A big reason that lots of people voted for Brexit was the opportunity to punish governments of both sides for failing to listen to their concerns about failing public services, about immigration and rising unemployment. Wouldn't any future British government thinking about rejoining first have to demonstrate to the public that they were listening to people on those issues and making progress? And if that were the case, well, why would people vote to change a system that appeared then to be working?
Well, any government that doesn't listen to the concerns of its own people is going to have a very short shelf life. I don't think it was big. I agree with you. I think people often said, if you spoke to them, if you interviewed them, that the government was out of touch. But actually, when you do speak to people and speak to people today, one of their biggest concerns is the cost of living crisis, is the lack of opportunity, is the lack of work, and the difficulty with the energy crisis, meeting energy costs and so on. And the difficulty in regulating migration. Britain left the European Union and migration doubled under Boris Johnson. It didn't go down, it went up. So I think we have to listen to concerns, and we have to demonstrate that actually meeting those concerns, particularly the economic and security concerns that people have, requires Britain to be closer to Europe and not further away.
Let's finish with your response to this statement. A decision as seismic and complicated as leaving the European Union was far too important to be decided by a public hungry for soundbites and easy answers.
I agree with that. And we can see in the last 10 years, Britain has had 7 prime ministers, and there's a new one on the way. And Brexit is not settled. It was not settled by the referendum that took place 10 years ago. That the referendum, the result of the referendum itself opened the can of worms, and we're still suffering from the consequences of that, the instability of that, and it is still playing itself out. So I think that that's right. I don't think you can settle those issues in that way with a referendum on one day, as the experience of Britain since the referendum 10 years ago shows. It's still very much a live issue. Nothing is properly settled, and it will go on for generations to come.
Good talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Roger Casale from the New Europeans.
Thank you.